What is up? Daniel here with the Virtual Robotics Studio, and we are now ready to assemble our transmissions. But before we get started, as always, special thanks to First and Argosy Foundation for making this all possible. Okay, so for our transmissions, we're going to need the transmissions. So in that Andy Mark AM14U5, that kit chassis box, we're looking for two bags that look like this. So this has all of the transmission parts in it. We're going to be building two transmissions today. And this is kind of the parts of that bag broken out so we can kind of see what's going on here. You'll also need 4 of these sim motors. So they're the big, they're black. I think the ones in the kit of parts are going to say Andy Mark 12 VDC 2.5 inch sim motor on them. So we need 4 of those. Tooling wise, pretty simple. We actually just need a 5/32 Allen wrench. You can either use the handled one or the angle. You're going to need some kind of socket to help us push a retaining clip on. I'm using a 3/8 inch socket here. That was about the right size, but anything close to that should work. I've got a bin to keep my parts straight, and we're going to be greasing these, so of course I've got some shop rags to clean up. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is get the hardware bag, and I'm going to empty that out into my container here. So that has got bolts. It's got these push-on retaining rings. We've got these E-clips that we're going to need to use. What else we got in there? Some washers and a little tiny machine key. So that right there is going to be used to attach the motor to its gear. All right, so we'll kind of get those set. Next up, let's open up our bag of gears here. And one thing that you'll find in the bag of gears is this piece is it's just a little metal dowel. And we only need to use this dowel if you have encoders that you want to mount on the robot. So this is something that you can do. You can actually go back and do it after the fact too. But right now we don't need it, so I'm just going to put that back in the bag. And we'll save that for later. All right, gears wise, we have kind of the biggest gear. That's a 50-tooth gear. The next biggest gear, it's just a little bit smaller. That is a 45-tooth gear. And then we've got our 19-tooth gear here, and these are 14-tooth gears. So we kind of have the biggest one, and then the slightly smaller, and then we have the smallest ones and the slightly bigger one. All right, so we'll get those ready. And then actually the first parts we need, we have to get into this bearing bag here. So we'll tear that open. We're going to save the container of red tacky grease for later. But we're going to need those bearings. And the bearings are going to be part of our first step. So this is the transmission housing. This is kind of the main transmission body. It's going to hold all the pieces together. And if we look at it, there's a bunch of holes. All the little holes here are just going to be bolt holes eventually. But there are kind of these 4 big holes that make kind of a plus shape on the inside. The 2 on the sides, those are going to be for motors. We're going to end up attaching our motors there. The top and bottom ones here, actually, before we move on, the round part, if I hold it this way, you can see this is round edged. That's actually going to be the bottom of the transmission. If I flip it over, this flat, smooth side is going to be the top. Okay, and so the bottom hole and the top hole here are going to be holding bearings that will then support the gears inside the gearbox here. So what we want to do is we want to look for our bearings. There are 2 different kinds of bearings here. So the ones we're going to use, they're the 2 that look exactly the same. These are, if I look on them, they say R6Z. So we're looking for R6Z bearings here. And the thing with these is they're smooth all the way across. They're flat all the way across the edge of the bearing. Some of the other bearings have what we call a flange on them. So like this one here has this extra lip on the side. And that's a flange. So that's not going to work on the inside for what we're doing now. So we need the 2 that are the same, those 2 R6Z bearings. And we're going to drop those into that top and bottom hole. So I'll just go ahead and push one in the bottom hole here. And you should be able to do it with your hands. Just wiggle it. You want it to try to go in nice and straight. So if it's on a big angle, push whatever side is highest up and kind of just work your way around. You shouldn't have to hit this with anything. It should just go in. Okay, so we have our 2 bearings in there. Now remember, the round side is the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to flip it over so the round side is facing down here, and we got the flat side on the top. And the next thing we're going to do is we're looking for this shaft. So this is kind of our small shaft. It's got round ends, and then the middle here is sort of this hex shape. And we're just going to take one of the round ends and drop that into the top hole, the bearing on the top hole here. And it'll go in until the hex hits. And it should be able to spin nice and freely because it's in a bearing. Okay, and now we're looking for the biggest gear. So remember we had two gears that were close in size, the 50 and the 45 tooth. So we're going to take the 50 tooth gear and we're going to drop that right onto that little axle that we put in. Now, the gear is symmetrical, so it doesn't matter which way you put it in. It looks the same on both sides. So you just got to kind of get that lined up. And what might happen is you might have to wiggle it a bit to get the hexes to line up. But eventually that will drop right on, and it should spin nicely as well. Okay, then on top of that gear, we are looking for not the smallest one. So again, we have the very small one, and then the slightly bigger one. We need the slightly bigger one. This, I think, is a 19-tooth gear. And we're going to drop that right on to the shaft as well. So now these are both on the same shaft, which means when we power the bottom one, when we power the bottom gear, this next gear is going to also spin with it. So we can use that to be our second stage of the transmission. Okay, we're going to set this aside for just a second. And we're looking for our big axle here. So it's also got hex. It's got some circles on both sides, funny shapes as well. And on this one, if you look on one side, it's sort of round, and then it goes right into the hex. If you travel down the hex the other side, there's this little groove. And then it's round, and then it's a smaller round. So we're looking for that side. And what we need to do here is dig into our box of stuff. We are looking for an E-clip. Okay, so this is the one that it sort of looks like the letter E. But this is just a retaining clip. And what we're going to try to do is get this lined up into that groove on our output shaft here. So that should sit right in the groove. If you're very strong, you might be able to push it in with your fingers. I can't. The easiest way I found to put this together is if you just kind of put it down towards the table and just push down on it. You can get it to snap in. Maybe. Oh, let's try that one more time. It will be a little tight. There it goes. So the key is you got to try to push straight. And once it's in, just double check that all of the points of the E are inside that groove, so it's locked in there nicely. If the table trick doesn't work for you, you can set it kind of up and try to get it started by tapping on it gently with a hammer. You might have success if you have a big enough pair of pliers, but shouldn't be too bad to get it lined up and push it on the table. All right, so now this is ready to go into our transmission housing. So we'll go back to our transmission housing here. And the bottom hole, we're going to drop this in. We want that E-clip that we just put in to be facing down. So that's going to go in there. Okay, a little snug, but it fits nicely. And that E-clip should be just above this gear. So the gear should still spin. If it's crashing into the E-clip, then we got to take it out and figure out where that interference is coming from. But it should just be above it. And that E-clip is going to end up supporting the gear that we're about to put on, which is the other big one. So this is our 45-tooth gear. And again, it's the same on both sides. So either way you want, we're going to drop it onto this axle all the way down. And you'll know it's right. You'll know you have everything right because the teeth of the 45-tooth gear and our 19-tooth gear are going to be meshed together. They're going to be interlocked like that. So when I spin one shaft, it makes the other shaft spin. And we can kind of right now, while it's like this, do a really quick visualization of the gear ratio that's going on here. So if I put a mark kind of on both of these gears, you should be able to see as I spin this around, right? So as I spin the small gear around once, that big gear, so that was one full rotation of the small gear, the big gear's not all the way around yet. If I spin it around again, it's still not quite all the way around yet. I have to spin it another, not quite, just about a third of the way. So what that means is, because this is a 19-tooth gear and this is a 45-tooth gear, we have to spin it 2 times, and that's 19 plus 19 teeth pass by, so that's going to be 38 teeth. And then we need to do 7 more teeth to get to 45. So this is doing 2-point-something times rotations in order for this big one to do 1. That means the speed of our motor is getting reduced by that 2-point-something times. And so it's the same thing with our other small gear. So we have this 14-tooth gear that's going to go on the motor, which will drop down here and power our first big gear, that 50-tooth gear. So 50 divided by 14, it's what, like a little more than 3.5. So it's something like 3.5 times the little gear has to spin to make this big gear spin. And then we have a little bit more than 2 times to make this small gear and big gear ratio. So you actually multiply those ratios together. So 3.5 times a little more than 2. And I looked it up. This transmission overall is 8.45 to 1, which means our motor is spinning some fast speed going in. This output shaft will be 8.45 times slower, which is actually what we want. If it's spinning full speed on the motor, first of all, the robot is probably uncontrollably fast. You're going to crash into stuff. But also, the motor needs to have enough torque or enough strength to kind of get the wheels turning. And if your gear ratio is too low, you won't actually be able to move the robot at all. So that's why we need this gearbox. OK, so this one is actually set. We're going to now take our second gearbox up to the same point. All right, it is time to get a little messy now. So I'm going to lay some of these shop rags or fancy paper towels out just to try to keep the table a little cleaner. And let me get another one ready to wipe my hands. So we need our container of this red grease that came in it. And you get 2 of them. I don't think we'll need to use both of them, all of both of them. So let's just go ahead and get one open. I think there's a little tear spot here. And our goal is to just get a layer of grease over all of the gears that we've put in. And the easiest way to do that is you kind of squeeze it out, and you can turn the gears kind of as you go. But ultimately, you will have to wipe it on with your fingers too. So there's no real way to stay clean other than getting some gloves first. All right, and I'm going to try to get it all the way around this top gear here. And we can kind of spin and see that that's pretty well coated. I also want to do the same thing on the bottom gear that's a little harder to get to. So I'll be kind of reaching down, squeezing some in and reaching down inside there. And we have to sort of still spin that gear around as we're doing it to sort of spread the grease out. And it doesn't have to be perfect because, again, when we run it, the grease will sort of, work its way around to coating everything. But we want to get it, as nicely covered as we can here. Looks like you can also reach through the bottom hole. So that feels pretty good. I think I have a coating all the way around the outside of that. And while we do the second one, let's talk about why do we need the grease. So it turns out that the gears, there's still like a decent amount of friction happening between the gears. And if you run your transmission for a long period of time without any grease in it, the grease is there to kind of reduce that friction and reduce that wear. You will end up wearing down the teeth on the end of the gears. And eventually, there will not be enough teeth left to connect. So eventually, you'll be able to wear down your gears and they will break. Your transmission will break. So you want to make sure it's greased before you run it for any significant period of time. All right, a little bit more on that one. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. So you can see I used maybe half of one of these containers of grease. That's about the amount I put on. But if you get a lot, kind of stuck on the sides or on top of the gears, just add a little more. But again, make sure you kind of see that red going all the way around both our top and bottom gears here. All right, so we are done with the grease for now. Let me clean this up. I'm going to wipe off a little bit of the extra, anywhere I got a little bit extra grease, just to try to keep everything a little bit neater. And then we will slide this off to the side and start working on our motors. So go wash your hands if you need to. But next step is to grab one of these sim motors. And this step that we're about to do now, we're doing it the same way for every motor. So again, we have 2 transmissions, 4 motors. Theoretically, everybody could do a motor at the same time if you have enough people. All right, so on the motor, one thing we want to look at is there is a small keyway here. So there's a little cutaway in the shaft. And that is where we are going to need to put a key. So the issue is if I put a gear on here, the gear spins on the shaft, but the shaft isn't spinning, right? Or I could spin the shaft and the gear would stay still. So we need to find some way to link these two together, to lock them together mechanically. And so that groove on this output shaft and on this little gear, you can actually see, there it is on the top here, there's a little cutaway that is our keyway. And that little tiny, let's find it here in the box, there's that little tiny machine key. It's almost invisible, but it fits inside that gear. So this little tiny square key will fit inside there, and it will also fit inside this groove on our motor here, if I can do it without dropping it. And sometimes if it's a little tight, make sure you get like one corner in, and it should then go down and sit flat in there. Right? So you've got that key in there. Now, that's not the first step, but remember that we're going to have to do that. The first step, though, is we don't want to be able to push this all the way in, because then the gear and the motor wall would be rubbing against each other, which we don't want. So we're going to put some washers in first. So the first thing is to find 2 of these washers. And we're going to just drop them onto our motor shaft, like that. So just all the way into the inside. Then we're ready to put the key on. So again, work your key down in there. And where you put it, inside to outside, the key is when we slide this gear on now and line up the keyways. As long as the key is completely inside there, like I don't see really any of it poking out, then we're in a good spot. If your key is way out on the edge and you slide this in and you still see like a lot of that key sticking out in that extra bit of keyway there, of groove, then it's a little bit too far out. We want to make sure the whole key is being used to transfer our torque or our power here. So that looks good. And now you can see when I spin the gear, it makes the motor shaft spin. Or if I spin the motor shaft, it makes the gear spin, which was not happening before. Our last problem is this can still just fall off. There's nothing holding it on. So for that, we're going to look back in our bin. We're looking for this piece. This is our push-on retaining ring. And we're going to need, along with that, our socket, our 3/8 socket. And what we want to do on this retaining ring is we have to look pretty closely. Like there's one side of it where you can kind of see the teeth pointing up. Oh, come back. All right, you can see the teeth are pointing in one direction. So like this way, the teeth are pointing up. And this way, they're kind of sloped down away from me. So that's the direction that we want to push in. You can also see it's kind of like the rounded side. The other one, you can sort of feel the edge on the outside. So that edge on the outside should be facing out when we do this. And we're going to like line that up on the end of the motor shaft here. And it's very hard to push this on by hand. So that is where our socket is going to come in. So with the socket, if I kind of rest this on the socket, again, with the rounded side facing up, the teeth kind of will go into the socket a little bit here. Then I can use that socket to get some leverage to kind of just start pushing that on. And once you get it started, you can kind of just wiggle it and push until it is all the way down and touching that gear. Now the gear can't fall off. That retaining clip is holding it in place. All right, and that is a complete sim motor. So next step, we're going to rush through and make 3 more just like it, so we have 4 total. Okay, I was assembling them, and this one, I can't get the key to go all the way in. So the key is kind of in there. Let's see, there we go. The key is kind of in there, but when I go to put this on, even when I line up the keyway, like it won't go in. And looking closely, it's because the key is not all the way down flat. There's a couple things. It might be some burrs on the keyway here. So you might be able to rub a file on it. Another easy solution is you can usually just get a pair of pliers, especially if you have big ones, and sort of squeeze on it, and that'll push it in the rest of the way. So now this should slide on no problem. All right, we've got all 4 of our motors done. So we are now ready to attach them. So I guess I'll drag my transmissions back over. And one thing we can do, we should have enough grease already in the transmission, but if you want to be extra safe, we could, while these are out and easy to get to, we could put a little bit of grease around the outside of these gears as well. And that probably will get the job done. All right, I'll do all of these. All right, that looks good. Let's get that as much as I can off my hand here. Okay, now these motors, they're going to come up from the bottom of these transmissions. And we said there's going to be one on each side. So they're going to kind of come up this way, and the gears should lock together, okay, like that. So what we want to do, though, is if you look at the motor carefully, and we'll wipe off some of that extra grease, there are what looks like 4 holes around the outside. But 2 of the holes, I think these 2 holes, have stuff in them. Like you'll see, there's things there that's kind of holding the case together. So we need to use the 2 empty holes and line those up with the 2 holes on our transmission. So when I bring this in, I'm going to lock them together, and then I'm going to look down in here for our holes and try to get the empty hole, which I can see kind of on the side right here. So when I bring that around, I'm looking until that empty hole lines up on the inside here with the 2 holes I have on the transmission. Okay, and then we need to make sure we grab the right, actually let me slide that out while we grab the right set of hardware here. Inside that bag, which I've dumped all out in here, there are 2 different bolts. All right, so kind of set those down. And first of all, you can tell which one's which because one of them is taller than the other. So the taller one is the one we do not want. We want the shorter one. Another thing that you can just barely make out is there's this sort of nylon patch on here. So there's like this tannish colored area. And that is also to help retain it. So we used like the nylock nuts in the earlier step when we were putting the frame together because the nylon will dig onto the bolt thread and kind of hold it in place and stop it from loosening up. Well, the nylon patch on this bolt is going to do the same thing. So I'm going to get 2 of those nylon nuts ready. I'm going to get my handled Allen wrench ready. And then we'll go ahead and put this back in place. So we're going to drop this in, line up those holes, and then we're going to have to gently line up that bolt so we can screw it in. And you might have to rotate stuff around to get it lined up so that it bites and starts going. And if your bolt gets tight very, very quickly, like after one turn, and you can't make it move anymore, then you might be going into the wrong hole. So double check that the open holes are lined up. But it will get a little bit tight when that nylon patch hits. All right, there's one. Let's get our second one going here. You want to snug these down, make these tight, make these nice and tight. And that's one side. Now let's do the other side. So 2 more of those nylon patched bolts here, another motor. Line up the empty holes. And then we'll drop it down in there. If you have a really hard time getting the bolt to line up with the hole and get started, you can, it'll be messy, but you can always take the gears out just to get more space around there to get it started and then put your gears back in. Okay, that's good. And the last bolt, here we go. That one is not starting. So I'm going to loosen the other one up a little bit just so I have some adjustment here. So it's always good to get all your bolts started before you start tightening them down all the way. Let's see, which way do we have to adjust? There it goes. Okay, so we'll go ahead and tighten that one all the way in. I'm going to go back and retighten the one I loosened up a bit. and then the last thing we're going to do with this transmission is we have those flanged bearings that we pulled out earlier. And there are two different sizes. One is the big size with a hex-shaped hole in the middle, and one's a little bit smaller with a round hole in the middle. So one of them will be FR6Z, and then the other one will be FR8ZZ hex. So that the hex one, we're just going to drop onto our hex shaft. You want the flanged part, that extra part, to be facing in. So that's on the bottom here when that goes in. And you do have to get the hexes to line up. So sometimes you got to kind of hold on to that middle bit and wiggle it a bit to get it to line up and drop on. And then the round one just goes on the other round hole. Again, the flange should be facing down. So when we go to slide this into something, the other piece will slide on, and then the flange will hit and stop it from going any farther. All right, and that is a complete transmission. So I'm going to set this one to the side, get the second one finished, and then we should be all set with our transmissions. Okay, so our transmissions are assembled as far as we can take them. Next step, if your chassis is already done, you can jump to the next video and start assembling them onto the chassis. If not, wait until your first step chassis people are done. Just another tip, I'm going to take the leftover grease and get it into one of these Ziploc bags so it doesn't get all gross everywhere. And I'll do the same with the other bag, which looks like it's leaking a little bit. So the bolts that are left over here, we are going to use those, but in the next step to mount this to the frame. So if you're not ready for that step yet, just keep these bolts separate. Don't lose them. And that is it. We are done with our transmissions. We are done with this video. We'll see you in the next one. But before we go, as always, special thanks to First and Argosy Foundation for making this possible.